being here, and thank you for supporting the programs at St. Dunstan's. I can say that. I am Geoff Poor, the Storyteller, and I am joining Susanna Valleau, the Organist, otherwise known as the Hat. We are going to start with the organ this afternoon, and then we'll have the first story. That was pretty scary. I don't know if I can tell a story after that. All right, the angry moon. Lupin and Lapawinsa were the best of friends. Always they were together. They spent their time wandering in the woods and along the brook, around their village, and making arrows out of birch shoots and feathers. One day, they were walking back to the village late in the afternoon, and Lapawinsa said, "Look how ugly the moon is with all those lines on its face." And Lupin said, "Hush, don't talk so loud. The moon will hear you and become angry." But it was too late. The moon had heard, and the moon was very angry. Suddenly, a soft, dark rainbow descended and surrounded Lapawinsa. And when the rainbow vanished, Lapawinsa was gone. Lupin sat and cried, and then called for Lapawinsa over and over again. He searched around the field, he searched in the woods, but there was no Lapawinsa. He walked to the top of a small hill in the field and noticed that there was one star out. And not knowing why, he took out an arrow and shot it into the sky. It did not come back. He took another arrow and shot it into the sky, but it did not come back. Arrow after arrow, he shot up towards the clouds. And then after a bit, he noticed something dangling. More arrows, and it got closer to him, and it was a chain of the arrows that he had shot into the air. He shot his last arrow at it, and it turned into a ladder. Without hesitating, he jumped onto the ladder and started to climb up, into the clouds, not daring to look down. Strong winds swung the ladder in wide arcs. Driving rain tried to push him off the ladder, but he held tight and climbed and climbed and climbed until he came to the sky country. And he was so tired that he lay down and went to sleep without even looking around. And in his dreams, he heard a voice saying, "Wake up, I am coming for you. Wake up, I am coming for you." And then it said, "Wake up, I am here." And he opened his eyes, and there was a young boy there. And the young boy said, "Come with me. I will take you to my grandmother. She will help you." So off they went to the old grandmother's house. She invited them in and sat them down. She said to Lupin, "It is I who helped you on your journey to the sky country, because I could see that you were very brave and had a great need to get here." And he said, "Yes, I must find Lapawinsa." "Yes, I know. She has been captured by the moon and is being held captive in his house, which is not far from here. If you listen, you can hear her crying." So Lupin listened, and yes, he heard her crying and wailing as if in pain. And the grandmother and Lupin said, "I must go to her." And the grandmother said, "Yes, but first you must eat, for you're very weak from your journey." She held out her hand, and on it appeared a roasted fish. She held it out a second time, and there was a toasted ear of corn. A third time, and it was laden with fresh fruit. After Lupin had eaten, he made ready to go, but the old grandmother said, "Wait, you must take 4 things with you, for they will help you on your journey." And she gave him a pine cone, and a fish eye, and a rose, and a small stone. And off Lupin went to the house of the moon. The closer he got, the louder he could hear Lapawinsa crying. And when he got close enough to see, he saw that Lapawinsa was stuck in the smoke hole in the roof of the house of the moon, crying as if in pain. He climbed up onto the roof and over to her, being very careful to step softly so that the moon would not hear him. When he got close to Lapawinsa, she was overjoyed and stopped crying. And he said, "No, don't stop crying. The moon must not know that I am here." So she kept on crying while he pulled her out of the smoke hole, and then he put in the pine cone, which started to wail just as she had done. The two of them climbed down off of the roof and started to run. But soon the pine cone withered in the heat and stopped making noise. The moon realized that he had been tricked, and he was furious. He rolled out of his house and went after Lupin and Lapawinsa. He was huge and yellow, with fierce eyes and long rows of white teeth, and he rolled after them closer and closer and closer, and when he had nearly caught them, Lupin tossed the fisheye behind him, and there was a huge lake. The moon could not stop in time. He rolled into the water, splashing water everywhere. Cold and wet, he backed out of the lake and had to go all the way around it to try and catch up with Lupin and Lapawinsa, who were far ahead. But the moon rolled very fast, and soon he was on their heels again. Lupin tossed behind him the rose, and there was a huge thicket of tangled rose bushes. The moon was stuck. Struggling and scratching himself on his thorns, he fought his way through. When he got out, he was furious. The whole sky shook with his rage, and he rolled faster than ever after them. When they could feel his cold breath on their backs again, he tossed the pebble behind him. There was a gigantic mountain there. So steep it was that the moon could not climb it. He helplessly rolled up and down and up and down and up and down, while Lupin and Lapawinsa ran back to the old grandmother's house. When they arrived, they were breathless and exhausted, but they were laughing with relief. The old grandmother said, "Your ladder is still there, and you may return to the ground whenever you wish." So they thanked the old grandmother and the boy for all their help, and they climbed down the ladder, never once stopping to rest. So eager were they to get down. When they got down to the ground, the sun was just coming up, and all of the arrows that had made the ladder collapsed in a heap at their feet. They put the arrows back in Lupin's quiver and walked to their village. They were met, of course, with cries of joy. They led long and happy lives, and for many, many years afterwards, people came from miles and miles around to hear their story of their adventures in the Sky Country. And Lupin and Lapawinsa never once tired of telling the story one more time. Thank you.
Hi, welcome to St. Dunstan's. My name is Susanna Valleau. I know I look like a witch, but I really am the music director here at this beautiful church, and I just wanted to welcome and thank you for coming to be here this afternoon. Next up, we have some pumpkin carols, and this is some audience participation. So if you wouldn't mind opening your programs to page 4, I promise you'll know the tunes. Why don't we stand and get ready to sing our 2 pumpkin carols?
even as a child, had an inevitable submission to the dance. As the wind sways trees in their branches, she swayed to music with perfect sympathy and grace. Her parents were the king and queen and often held grand balls, and everybody wanted to dance with Princess Viola. It was bittersweet for them, though, because it was clear to everyone that Princess Viola was only dancing with the music and not with her dance partners. But when they were honest with themselves, the other dancers would have preferred just to stand and watch her dance. So beautiful were her movements. As time went on, the king and queen betrothed Princess Viola to Prince Hugo. Prince Hugo was very happy about this. Princess Viola was not. She knew him to be a somewhat overbearing and imperious young man, and she could not imagine living with him forever. On the night of the betrothal party, there was a ball, and she slipped out early to go wandering around the castle grounds. And she came to an old maze which had been installed by a previous king. People had long since lost the map to find the center. It was overgrown, and indeed nobody had gone in there for years. Some said it was not wise to go in there. But Princess Viola pushed her way through the front gate, wound her way through the overgrown paths, and came to the center of the maze. It was a bright, full moon, and the center of the maze was a huge circle with soft sand underneath. She walked to the center of the maze, reached up to the sky, and said, "Oh, my beautiful dancing room, why did I not know about you before? But music, there must be music." Quite suddenly, the air was filled with the sound of a grand invisible orchestra. It played a slow, languid, beautiful saraband. Slowly she swayed in drowsy grace. Slowly her satin shoes slipped over the silver sand. And then it ended with a crash of cymbals, and then there was a dance of caprice, with the notes pummeling and pouncing upon the violin strings, laughing and leaping. She stepped faster and faster, spinning, pirouetting, and turning. The music was as soft as thistledown, as fierce as fire, and as smooth as a rapid stream. When she left the maze and was walking back to the castle, close to dawn, she encountered Prince Hugo. And he said, "Viola, where have you been? What have you been doing?" And she stamped her foot and said, "I will not be questioned." He said, "I have some right to question." And she laughed and threw her head back and flashed her eyes at him and said, "For the first time in my life, I have been dancing." Hugo could only mutter and walk away. The king and queen decreed that every month, on the night of the full moon, until the wedding, 1 year hence, there would be a grand ball. Every grand ball, Viola slipped out and went to dance in the maze. Prince Hugo knew about this, but he did not try to stop her. He did, however, tell her to enjoy her dancing in the maze while she could, because once they were married, he would forbid it, and, if necessary, have the maze ripped out. On the night before the wedding, at the last ball, she again slipped out of the maze, slipped out of the castle, and went down to the maze, sad and discouraged because this would be her last opportunity. The music was very fast that night. She danced and pirouetted and spun around the maze, and then there was a soft bit of shadow that started to cover the moon, and it covered more and more of the moon. It was the night of a full eclipse. She did not pay attention. She danced and danced and danced, intoxicated by the music. And when the night was completely dark and the moon was gone, she had the sudden feeling that for the first time in her life, she was not dancing alone. The next morning, Princess Viola did not come down to breakfast. She was nowhere to be found. They searched the castle, they searched the ground, they searched the maze, they searched the villages, they searched the fields, the woods, the brooks, but there was no sign of Princess Viola. Indeed, Princess Viola was never seen again. Except, one night after her disappearance, on the next full moon, Prince Hugo, was walking around the castle grounds, and he went into the maze. He found his way to the center and stood there in the bright moonlight, and a bit of cloud passed in front of the moon, almost as if the moon was winking at him. He glanced up, and he almost smiled through his sadness, because there, in the glorious round silver moon, for just a moment, he clearly and unmistakably saw the face of a smiling Princess Viola.
just a heads up, I can see some really awesome costumes in the audience. Our costume contest runners are going to have their eyes out. And in case I forget to say it later, after the concert, please gather out back there, and the winners will get their prizes. So we'll see you back in like 5 or 10 minutes.
Our next
performance, a reading or a recitation of the Raven. Afterwards, we won't be ready to just jump right into pumpkin carols. We'll need a minute, so I'll give you just a little bit of nice organ music. And then when you hear the carol, though, you can stand up and be ready, but we'll need that moment. So now, the Raven.
Boo. The Raven has to be right up there with the creepiest poems ever written. It's a story about a man who's not doing too well. He is in despair at the loss of his beloved Lenore. He's sitting in his home. There's a fire in the hearth. It's a dark winter night. He's trying to read to distract himself from his sorrow, but it's not working. And he gets visited by a raven, which we do have in Seattle, although they're not as common as crows. He gets visited by a raven. At first, he's kind of amused and welcomes the distraction. But as the story unfolds, it turns out that the raven is not there to do him any favors at all or comfort him. And indeed, the raven turns out to be very bad for his mental health. There's one word in the Raven which figures near the end that we don't use much anymore, and that is nepenthe. It goes back to the Greeks, and it's something that people drink to cure themselves of, well, loss and despair and those feelings. So, The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, "rapping at my chamber door, only this and nothing more." Distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow. Sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my door, merely this and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, 'Lenore?' This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, 'Lenore.' Merely this and nothing more." Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping, somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven, of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling by the grim and grave decorum of the countenance it bore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly, grim, and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door. Bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door with such name as Nevermore. But the raven, still beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then, upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking Nevermore. This and more I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose purple velvet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer swung by seraphim, whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee respite and nepenthe from these memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget the lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aidenn it shall clasp a saintly maiden whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. And the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul, from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor, shall be lifted nevermore. Washington Irving wrote mostly in the early 1800s, and he is sometimes considered the father of the American short story. Before he did his writing, short stories tended to be very formal and formulaic and always to have a moral, so they were more teaching than entertainment. Washington Irving gave the short story license to be entertainment for its own sake. There's lots of inside jokes. It seems he's always winking at the reader when you read his stories. And in this story, it seems like he's poking fun at other previous short story writers as well. So, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. On the eastern shore of the Hudson River, a bit north of New York City, there's a village called Tarrytown. And a few miles inland from Tarrytown, there's a very quiet, peaceful valley. Walking through the valley on summer day, one is likely to hear nothing more than perhaps the whistle of a quail or the tapping of a woodpecker. It is so peaceful that streams running through there, it's kind of like a little nook of quiet water off to the side, the valley is. So there's maybe a straw or a bubble resting peacefully despite the rushing torrent nearby. The people that live in this valley, which is called Sleepy Hollow, walk around in a kind of continual reverie, and they are given to all sorts of strange beliefs and stories and things and visions. Into this valley of Sleepy Hollow one day in the 1790s came a man named Ichabod Crane. He was well suited to his last name, Crane, for he was extremely tall and skinny and lank, with great long arms, his hands stuck out of his sleeves by a mile, and his feet could have been used as shovels. He seemed like a loose appendage of body parts. He had a bit of a flat top to his head. He had green, glassy eyes, and he had a long, snipe nose that reminded people of a weather vane on top of a barn trying to figure out which way the wind is blowing. He came to Sleepy Hollow to serve as the schoolmaster for the children of the valley, and he was highly regarded as a man of great learning. His salary was so meager, though, that in order to make ends meet, he would room 1 week at a time with the families of the children in his classes. On Sunday afternoons, he could be seen walking from one farm to another with all his worldly possessions tied in a large red handkerchief. If you saw him walking across the top of a hill or a ridge in the wind with his clothes flapping and bagging around him, he looked like nothing so much as a scarecrow recently eloped from a cornfield. The most prominent farmer, the most prosperous farmer of Sleepy Hollow was a man named Baltus van Tassel, and he was one of the many Dutch farmers there. His farm was spectacular. His barn had swoops of swoops of swallows and martins and pigeons flying about. There were whole families of pigs and cows down below. In the pond, there were squadrons of snowy geese convoying fleets of ducks. And in the barnyard, there were regiments of chickens and guinea fowls and turkeys. Baltus van Tassel and his wife had but one child, and that was the lovely and charming Katrina. She had many suitors, and after a bit, Ichabod Crane became quite smitten with Katrina for two reasons. One, she was beautiful and charming, and also he recognized that she was inevitably going to be the heir to the great estate of Van Tassel. And he had wonderful visions of himself standing on the porch as the lord of this manor, with the beautiful Katrina by his side and perhaps a passel of kids running around, entertaining all who came to visit them. The other major suitor for Katrina was a man named Abraham van Braun, otherwise known as Bram Bones. He was a rakish jokester, irreverent, but good at heart, and people were quite fond of him. They would kind of alternate, Ichabod and Bram Bones, in visiting Katrina and taking her for walks down by the brook or through the orchards, or maybe sitting in the sitting room singing hymns. Katrina, who was known to be a bit of a coquette, indeed, she wore her petticoats so short that not just her feet, but her entire ankles were visible to a wandering eye. She seemed not to discourage the attentions of either of these two worthies. And so matters stayed for quite some time, until one day the Van Tassels decided that they would hold a big party. They invited everybody for miles around, including, of course, Ichabod and Bram Bones. Ichabod decided that he wanted to make a positive impression on Katrina and wanted to arrive in the style of some cavalier. So he borrowed a horse from the farmer that he was staying with and imagined himself arriving at the Van Tassel estate in the manner of some grand knight-errant who had simply stopped off on the way to a grand romantic adventure like slaying dragons or something like that. The actual picture of Ichabod on this day, however, differed from this vision in several respects. The horse he borrowed was actually merely a broken-down plow horse, scarcely larger than a pony. It had a swayed back, a crooked neck, and a hammer for a head. It had only one eye, and it couldn't see very well out of that one. Its mane and its tail were covered with tangles of burrs. Incongruously, its name was Gunpowder. To see Ichabod Crane sitting on Gunpowder, with his stirrups high and his knees pointing up towards the sky and his elbows and the riding crop stuck out at odd angles, he looked much more like a grasshopper than a horseman. So he went to this estate, to the party, and after he was amazed by the sumptuous presentations, the hams, the yams, the sides of beef, the pies, the cakes. He was quite amazed and once again had visions of himself as the proprietor thereby. After the meal, the men retired to the porch to smoke their pipes and tell stories about the goblins and ghosts of Sleepy Hollow. In particular, there was the story of the Headless Horseman. He was a figure on horseback whose head had unfortunately been carried away by a cannonball during the Revolutionary War. And he was said to ride around Sleepy Hollow every night in search of his head. But he always had to return to the graveyard by the church before dawn. So people were sitting there telling all kinds of stories, and Ichabod Crane was getting a little bit concerned about life in Sleepy Hollow, and Bram Bones, regularly glancing over at Ichabod, told the story about meeting up with the Headless Horseman at midnight down by the huge tulip tree close to the church. He said he challenged the Headless Horseman to a race and would have won, except that when they got close to the church graveyard, the Headless Horseman and his horse vanished in a flash of fire. Well, when people were starting to leave, poor Ichabod went in to talk to Katrina. I don't pretend to know what was said during that brief interview, but when it was over, Ichabod was crestfallen and sad and walked over to the barn and got on Gunpowder and started to head back. The road he had to travel passed by the tulip tree and the graveyard. The night was nearly as dismal as poor Ichabod's spirits. He was afraid constantly. At one point he decided to whistle for courage and was horrified when another whistle came back. But that was just the wind in the breeze, the wind in the leaves. He saw something white hanging from a tree, but no, that was just a place where lightning had scathed the wood, revealing the white wood underneath the bark. And then he heard moans and groans. but that was the wind brushing boughs against each other. He came down the hill towards the old tulip tree, and he stopped. He didn't know if he dared proceed after all the stories he'd heard in his head earlier in the evening. And then he heard the splash of a foot into the ground. And then he heard heavy breathing. He didn't know what to do. And then out of the gloom underneath the tree bounded this huge horse with some kind of misshapen figure on top. He didn't know what to do. How could he outrun this creature with old gunpowder? So he said, Who are you? There was no answer. He tried to ask again, but he was so afraid that he was incapable of producing speech. So he started gunpowder down the road, hoping that this other creature would stay behind. But no, he followed. He decided to go faster. This other traveling companion also went faster. He decided to slow down and stop, hoping that the horse and whatever was riding this horse would pass him. But no, his traveling companion kept pace with him step by step. And then, coming over a small hill, he looked back and he saw that the man on the horse behind him had no head. And worse, that his head was sitting on the pommel of the saddle in front of him. Ichabod screamed. He rained blows down on Gunpowder, who unexpectedly burst into a run. They ran down towards the church graveyard. Ichabod turned back and looked, and he was horrified to see that the headless horseman was preparing to throw his head at him. He tried to duck, but the horrible missile crashed into his cranium, and he fell to the ground. The headless horseman and his horse vanished in a flash of fire. The next morning, Gunpowder was found near the gate to his farm, grazing peacefully, his bridle at his feet. Ichabod did not show up for breakfast. He did not show up at the schoolhouse, and people went out looking. And at the bottom of the hill, near the bridge that led to the church graveyard, they found his hat. And next to his hat, a smashed pumpkin. People searched all over for Ichabod, but his body was never found. Some years later, one of the old farmers that lived there went to New York City to conduct some business. He came back with the intelligence that Ichabod Crane was alive and well in New York City. He had gone there and become a school teacher, and then a lawyer, and then a politician, and finally a judge. He had apparently left Sleepy Hollow either out of the humiliation of being refused by Katrina Van Tassel or maybe just fear of goblins. It was Bram Bones, of course, who wound up escorting Katrina down the aisle. And whenever people gathered to tell stories about Ichabod Crane and goblins in general, whenever it got to the part about the smashed pumpkin, Bram Bones was seen to laugh uproariously. And people got the impression that he knew more about the matter than he was prepared to tell. And there's a postscript to this story. This story was relayed to the author, and he said that he got it from a social conference, a social gathering in New York City where there was a storyteller. There were many prominent businessmen and politicians in the audience. And the storyteller was a shabby old gentleman with salt and pepper clothes and a sadly mournful face. And when he got through with the story, everybody laughed and congratulated him, except for one tall, thin gentleman in the audience who sat there with furrowed brow. And when the laughter died down, he raised his hand and he asked the storyteller what the meaning of the story was. What was the moral? The storyteller had been about to take a sip of wine as a reward for his efforts, but he put it down and he said, "Well, sir, 3 things come to mind. One is, there is no situation in life but can be turned to our advantage and pleasure if we can but see the joke in it. Secondly, he who runs races with goblins is bound to have a rough time of it. And thirdly, for a country schoolmaster to be refused the hand of a Dutch heiress is often a sure predictor of success later in life. And the man furrowed his brows further and said, well, that may be well and good, but still, he found the story a bit extravagant, and that there were one or two points in it that he doubted as to their veracity. And the storyteller smiled and said, well, sir, as for that matter, I don't believe half of it myself.